Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzhak Reuven speaking to you from south of Jerusalem. Today is the 18th day of the month of Tevet, 5783. It's the 10th of January, 2023. This coming Shabbat, we are going to begin the book of Exodus, Parshat Shemot, it's called in Hebrew, which begins, of course, in verse 1, chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, and concludes chapter 6, verse 1. A whole new book, a whole new chapter in the life of the children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We're going to get to that in just a moment. As I mentioned, it's the 18th day of the month of Tevet. We're going to be going through a bit of a quiet period for the next few weeks in terms of the Luach HaIvri, the Jewish calendar, the Hebrew calendar. Not much happens until Tu B'Shvat, which is the 15th of Shvat next month, which of course is the new year for trees. And as we get closer to that, much closer, we'll be talking about Tu B'Shvat, but I mention it only now because it's a quiet period. So we'll really be able to focus on the Parsha and on some current events when they occur, if they are relevant. Last week I talked a bit about the Minister of Internal Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir's ascent, 13-minute ascent to the Temple Mount, which made big waves all around the world, in which really nothing happened. But the world was, the West was all in a big hissy fit because Ben-Gvir went up to the mount. Why exactly? It's unclear. I mean, he has the right to go up to the mount, Temple Mount. He's been up there many times before. He is now a minister in the government, and a minister in the government certainly has the right to go up to the Temple Mount. He's not the first minister in the government to go up to the Temple Mount. And as the Minister of Internal Security, I think it's essential that any minister of internal security goes up to the Temple Mount to see it from close up, especially if it's someone who's never been up to the Temple Mount before. Of course, as I mentioned, Ben-Gvir has gone up many, many times, to see firsthand what's there, what the topography is, what the layout is. Go and see how the Jews are treated there. Go and see how the Muslims are regarded there. Get first-hand knowledge so that when you have to make a decision, you won't be making it out of complete ignorance. That's the general thing. I mean, it's a good thing. It's a positive thing that the Minister of Internal Security goes up to the Temple Mount. And I hope that he goes up many, many times throughout his term as Minister of Internal Security, and after that, for many, many, many years. But because the West, the United States, they made a big fuss. Of course, they were sort of, what could they do? I mean, he does have the right to go up there. He didn't infringe on any so-called status quo, no matter how you look at it. And the United States, who supposedly believes in and wants to promote freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of expression around the world. So they had a hard time protesting it as much as they did and as much as they wanted to condemn it. But of course, they had a cover because the left wing here in Israel, the people who lost the past election, are inciting 24/7 against the new government, totally irresponsible, and giving tremendous material to all Israel's detractors around the world. So when the United States protests that Ben-Gvir went up to the Temple Mount, and he was up and off the mount before anybody even woke up that morning, when they protest, what's the rest of the world going to do? Sit by and say, oh, silly United States? No. They take up, what can they do? What are the Arabs supposed to do? sit by and say, oh, what's the United States getting so upset about? No, the opposite. They say, well, if the United States is protesting it, then of course we have to. So the United States led the protests against Ben Gvir walking on the Temple Mount. It was pretty pathetic. But the advantage, the positive result, is that A, despite all their threats, Hamas didn't fire missiles into Israel as if Israel's supposed to take its marching orders from Hamas and not go up to the Temple Mount because they say they're going to bomb Israel if we do. But they didn't. In fact, they did send one rocket, apparently, which landed inside Gaza, as many of their rockets do. But nothing happened. The Arab nations that are part of the Abraham Accords are still part of the Abraham Accords. Egypt, of course, had to make a bit of a stink. They had to, of course. As I said, the United States did. So what are they going to do? Sit by quietly? No. But al-Sisi, the head of Egypt, reassured Israel that no damage has been done. But what's good is that everybody's talking about it. And it's getting more exposure. The idiocy of the alleged status quo in the Temple Mount, and the idea that Jews should not be able to freely access and freely pray on the holiest place in the world for them, is something that a lot of people involved in foreign administrations and even pundits around the world are having to deal with for the first time. And even in Israel, many people who oppose Ben Gvir, don't like Ben Gvir, many people who didn't vote for this government are saying, this is ridiculous. Jews have the right to go on the Temple Mount, and a minister in the government has the right to go on the Temple Mount, and Jews have the right to pray in the Temple Mount. And the Temple Mount is the holiest place in the world for the Jewish nation. And you can't take that away from us. So all this exposure and bad press, as it were, has been a real windfall in terms of exposing a lot of people around the world to the realities of the Temple Mount. The reality, the very bitter reality of the Temple Mount today, the limitations on Jewish presence and Jewish prayer on the Mount, and the historical reality of the Temple Mount, that there were two temples on the Temple Mount hundreds and hundreds of years before Muhammad was born, and it's been the holiest place for the Jewish nation for thousands and thousands of years. And a lot of the ignorance, and there's tremendous ignorance around the world concerning the Temple Mount and Israel's connection to the Temple Mount. A lot of that has been dispelled. There's still plenty of it around, and there's still plenty of people who want to believe what they want to believe, and they're not going to listen to facts or reason or intelligence, and they'll be happy to contradict themselves, just like so frequently the progressives and the radical left wing in the United States will contradict their own principles in order to support a cause that they think they should support. For example, Hamas, right? You see protests, gays for Hamas. In America, you see these protests. Really? Do you know what Hamas does to gays? But yet you support them. Hamas, who their credo is to destroy Israel and to eliminate the Jewish people. That's their plan. That's their goal. But you support them because it's in fashion. It's convenient. It's, the weak against the strong, the underdog against the overdog. Nonsense. So maybe perhaps some of those people throughout the world have gotten a bit of a glimpse of reality thanks to Ben Gvir's ascend to the Temple Mount. And I hope he does it many, many times, and I hope that every time he does it, more people take notice and say, wow, some things really have to change for the better on the Temple Mount. The only leader, if I use that word very loosely, world leader, that really seems to be in a bind is King Abdullah of Jordan, who barely maintains his grip on the reins of power in Jordan. He does so with an iron fist. You don't hear about it much because nobody wants to talk about it because I guess, he's a friend of the West, and maybe the alternative would be worse. But one of his lifelines, besides the fact that Israel provides much water, a very high percentage of Jordan's water, and electricity, and security, but the real lifeline for Abdullah is that he can claim that he controls and protects and guards over Al-Aqsa on the Temple Mount on behalf of all Islam. And so anything that is going to change exclusive control of the Temple Mount by Jordan and the Islamic Waqf is not to his benefit, because it weakens his position. So he's the big loser. Every time a Jew goes and prays on the Temple Mount, every time a Jew goes up to the Temple Mount, when Ben Gvir goes on the Temple Mount, and hopefully as we make more and more progress toward real freedom and equality on the Temple Mount, he'll be the big loser unless he wakes up and sees where his bread's buttered and starts to act intelligently. Okay. That's what I have to say for now about the Temple Mount, Ben Gvir. And again, he's just one of thousands and thousands of Jews going up to the Temple Mount every month. Numbers are growing and growing. Tov, let's go on to this week's Torah reading, Shmot. Shmot is the name of the first section that we read from in the book of Exodus. It's also the Hebrew name for the book of Exodus. And it means names, and it's simply because it's one of the first words of the first sentence, the first verse in the book of Exodus. And that's how these 5 books of Moses, these 5 books of the Torah, are named by the first significant word of the first verse in each of the book. Bereshit, Genesis. Bereshit is the very first word of the first book. Bereshit means in the beginning. So the first book of the 5 books, if we translate it from the Hebrew into English, the first, instead of Genesis, it would be in the beginning. And the second book, instead of Exodus, which is a bit of I always forget this word. Oh, it bothers me so much. It's a bit of a, not a teaser, but the word I'm looking for. Everybody uses it when you give away what's going to happen. But Shmot, names, is a very modest name for this book, and it doesn't really give away anything. So let's read the first few verses from the book of Shmot, Exodus, in Hebrew, then in English. Ve'ele Shmot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma et Yaakov ish uveito ba'u. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Issachar, Zvulun, uVinyamin, Dan v'Naftali, Gad v'Asher. Vayihi kol nefesh יוצאי ירח יעקב 70 נפש, ויוסף היה במצרים. וימות יוסף וכל אחיו וכל הדור ההוא, ובני ישראל פעו, וישרצו, וירבו, ויעצמו במאוד מאוד, ותמלא הארץ אותם. These are the names of the children of Israel who were coming to Egypt with Yaakov. Each man in his household came: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zvulun and Binyamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, and all the persons who emerged from Yaakov's loins were 70 souls, and Yosef was in Egypt. Yosef died, and all his brothers, and all that entire generation. The children of Israel were fruitful, teemed, increased, and became strong, very, very much so. And the land became filled with them. Okay, so picking up where we left off, the conclusion of the book of Exodus, in fact, backtracking a little bit, how do they do it on TV? Recap from last week's episode. They recap that Yaakov went into Egypt. Now, he's named here also Israel, the children of Israel, and he's named also Yaakov. Oftentimes, even though Yaakov retained these two names, as opposed to Avraham, once his name becomes Avraham, he's never called Avram again. You just wouldn't do that in Sarai, and Sarah would not be called Sarai again. But in the case of Yaakov, Israel, the names are interchangeable, although each one has a different significance. Israel is in the land of Israel. Israel's in the land of Israel. Israel is strength. Israel is Geula, is redemption. Yaakov oftentimes refers to Israel in exile. Israel not in the land. And so the children are almost always referred to as the children of Israel. Once in a while they'll say Yaakov. But Yaakov is sometimes Israel, sometimes Yaakov. And so he went down to Egypt. He was Yaakov. In Egypt he was Yaakov. When he comes back, he's Israel. So there are 70 souls, the children of Yaakov, Israel, and his grandchildren. 70 souls. And once we already read last week, at the end of the book of Genesis, how the children of Israel were doing very well and multiplying very rapidly. The people, Egypt was very, very good to the children of Israel. And things were going great. They went there on very positive terms. Yosef was going to take good care of them. Yosef was second in command to Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth at the time. And Israel was given the land of Goshen to live on with their flocks, perhaps the best land in all Egypt. Everything was going great. And that's often how it is, throughout the ages, throughout the millennia, when Israel and the children of Israel have had to move in exile from one place to another, from one country to another. They're always leaving a bad situation. Here they're leaving a famine. Throughout the history in Europe, they're either leaving pogroms against them, murderous riots against them, or edicts that they had to leave, or edicts that they had to convert to Christianity. And in the lands of Islam, also there were times when the rule became very harsh, and they were sometimes told to convert to Islam, otherwise they had to leave. So whenever Israel leaves, the new place is always a beacon of light, right? A beacon of hope. It's always better than where they left, because the new place is welcoming them for the time being. There's always a nation, there always has been a nation that has welcomed the children of Israel, whether it was most recently in history, the United States, right? The Golden Medina, people call it, the Golden Country, the country where everything is great. You can be equal, and everything is great. And Israel, the children of Israel, the Jews in America prospered. They did great, became very successful. They became part of the fabric, the cultural fabric, the social fabric, the political fabric of America. And things they were getting better and better. However, you can't say that they were multiplying or are multiplying and becoming stronger and stronger numerically, because, as we know, the Jews of America are the numbers are dropping because of intermarriage, because of simply not having children. But in terms of their social status, political, economic status, kept getting better and better until recently. And all of a sudden, the past few years, there's troubles, tremendous anti-Semitism. But how could the nation turn against them? They've given so much to America. Honestly, culturally and scientifically and politically and in all sorts of ways. America wouldn't be America without the Jews who went to America, escaping Russia, escaping Poland, escaping Germany during World War II, etc., etc. But, well, let's just read the next verse in the book of Exodus. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Yosef. He said to his people, "Behold, the people, the children of Israel, are more numerous and stronger than we. Come, let us outsmart it, lest it become numerous, and it may be that if a war will occur, it too may join our enemies and wage war against us and go up from the land." So, let's say a new king arose over Egypt. So there's a new king, a new pharaoh. He didn't know Yosef personally, and Yosef was already history. Who cares? That was yesterday. These people are too many. Now in America, as an example, you can't say the Jews are too many numerically because they're a tiny, tiny fragment of the population. But what do people say? Oh, these Jews are too powerful. They're too rich. They're in charge of the media. They're in charge of Hollywood, etc., etc. So it's basically a case of the more things change, the more things stay the same. In this case, it was the top man in Egypt, Pharaoh, who decided he had enough with the rising star of the Jews, who were growing more and more powerful simply by having children. So we know what happens next. Things are moving very fast in the book of opening chapters of the book of Exodus. And we concluded the book of Genesis. The narrative slowed down. The last, a quarter of the book, which covered on all 23 generations. It covered the 6 days of creation and 23 generations of man. But the last few chapters, the last quarter of the book, I would say, really slows down and really goes into detail about the story of Yosef and his brothers. And all the different twists and turns of that story, we really can follow it very closely. And here in the book of Exodus, we're moving fast again. They want to set the scene. They want to set the scene for the 10 plagues, for the Exodus, but things are moving fast. But it also is what happens when all of a sudden things go bad. Boy, they move fast. You don't have a chance. You don't have a chance to get out of there alive, because all of a sudden things go sour. And things went bad very quickly for the children of Israel, and he became enslaved, tasked with backbreaking labor to build cities for Pharaoh. And the first two people mentioned by name, first two new people, besides the recounting of the children of Israel, first two new people mentioned by name in the book of Exodus are of course, the two midwives, the two Hebrew midwives, whose names are Phua and Shifra. And they are instructed, of course, as you know, by Pharaoh to basically, when they're delivering babies, if it's a boy, to kill him. Infanticide. And we're told that they feared God and they did not do what Pharaoh commanded them. Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth, commanded these two women to make sure all the male babies are killed upon birth. But they didn't fear Pharaoh, they feared God. And they knew it was the wrong thing to do. And so they didn't do it, and when they were called to account for themselves, they simply said, I'm sorry, Pharaoh, these Hebrew women just give birth very quickly. By the time we come to help them, they've already had the baby and they're gone. So Pharaoh, the next thing says, he commands this entire nation to go after Hebrew baby boys and throw them in the river, throw them in the Nile. So we've gone from slavery to genocide very quickly. Very, very quickly. And things are looking very grim. And then we're told about this guy from the tribe of Levi who marries a woman from the tribe of Levi. And they have a baby boy. And he is good, we're told. Right? They had the baby boy. And it says in chapter 2, verse 2, the woman conceived and gave a birth to a son. She saw that he was good, and she hid him for 3 months. Good, tov in Hebrew. In fact, a midrash states that the name Moshe was given by his parents, right? Because the name Moshe was given to him by Pharaoh's daughter, who rescued him from the Nile, as we'll talk about in a moment. She gave him the name Moshe, which meant, because I drew him out of the water. But they say, Midrash says, that his parents named him Tuvia, because he was good, Tov. So there was something about this baby that affected everybody, not just his parents, but also the daughter of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, this evil man, powerful, powerful man, who is jealous of the growing population of the Hebrews. He enslaves them and now wants to eliminate them altogether. Yet he has a daughter who is the hero. I mean, she's, sometimes you might say, an unsung hero, but she is certainly the hero. She rescues Moshe. If it weren't for her, there'd be no story here. There'd be no Exodus. She rescued Moshe. She saw him in the river. She saw the basket that his parents put him in, while Moshe's sister, Miriam, she's not named yet, but we'll find out later, that's her name, his older sister, is watching from a distance to see what's going to happen to her baby brother. And this woman, Pharaoh's daughter, goes out walking first thing in the morning with all her servants, her handmaidens, to bathe in the Nile. And she sees this baby. It's clear that it's a Hebrew baby. And she rescues it and adopts it. And Moshe's sister goes up to her and says, would you like a wet nurse for the baby? I can get one from the Hebrews. And of course she sends her mother. So Moshe, until he was weaned, was in the care of his very own biological mother. And so he imbibed for those couple of years, I guess. He was nourished on his mother's milk and was brought up as a Hebrew, like every other Hebrew. And then he was turned over to Pharaoh's daughter to be brought up in the palace of Pharaoh. And the next thing we know is that Moshe is a grown lad. And he goes out and he sees his brethren being oppressed. And he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and he feels for his brother, right? And it says quite clearly, it says in chapter 2, verse 11, it happened in those days that Moshe grew up and went out to his brethren. He went to his brothers, right? Brother. Brothers is we've learned from the book of Genesis how important brothers are. And the word ach, brother, it's from the word which means to unify, to stick together. So he saw his brethren, despite the fact that he was brought up privileged in the palace of Pharaoh and he was separated from his brethren. As soon as he saw what was going on outside the palace and saw their oppression and their pain, his heart went out to them. And of course, he turned this way and that, saw there was no man, and he killed the Egyptian. Next day, he goes out again. He sees two of his brethren fighting, and he tries to break it up, and they are not particularly sympathetic. They don't want him to rule over them, tell them what to do. And they make it clear that they know that he killed the Egyptian. Moshe gets scared. Pharaoh finds out. Moshe flees. And he winds up by the well in Midian, where he is going to be taken into the house of Jethro, a priest of Midian, a man who was the master of all sorts of avodah zarah, all sorts of idolatries, a very respected man, and a man who was on a spiritual journey, it seems, because of his close relationship that he seemed to develop with Moshe, despite the fact, again, that he was an idolater. He just wasn't enlightened. He didn't know of the one God. Later we'll find out that when he hears of the one God, he is turned on and sold on the idea. But he takes Moshe in. Moshe shepherds his flocks, and that's where Moshe has his famous encounter in the Mount Horeb, the mountain of HaShem, where he sees a burning bush and stops and says, wait a minute, this is something out of the ordinary. I need to observe what's going on here. And of course, as soon as God has his attention, he begins to speak to Moshe. And of course, Moshe's life is changed dramatically at that moment. Only have a few more minutes to continue, and I have so much more to say about this Parshat Shemot. But God says, I've heard the cries of the children of Israel. I remember their pain. I remember my covenant with Abraham, with Yitzchak, and with Yaakov. And I'm going to save them, and you're going to be the guy to do it. I'm pointing you. Wow. So Moshe is like, me? But before we get to that, and we'll talk about that more next week, there's two things in God's statement. One is, he heard the cries of Israel. And then he remembered, right? Does God forget? Well, I don't know. I asked this question many times. We also know that God remembered Noah when he was in his ark in the middle of the flood. Did God forget Noah? In this case, what reminds God the children of Israel are crying out? The children of Israel didn't forget. They're crying out to God. They're crying out to the God of Abraham, of Yitzchak, of Yaakov, their fathers. It's a few generations down the road, and life is miserable. And where is God? He certainly doesn't seem to be taking good care of his people. But they cry out to God. And that's what caused God to kick into action, to begin to make the change, because the people cried out. God's waiting for this. He waits for us to cry out. He wants to hear from us. He wants to respond to our cries. But we need to make our voices heard. We need to make our passion, our pain, our desires, our dreams heard. Then God will respond. And in this case, God responds. He talks to Moshe. He has a plan. It's a wild plan. I'm gonna send you to talk to Pharaoh. Pharaoh's gonna refuse. Moshe's got a lot of doubts. There's so much more to talk about, and we will continue next week. Thank you so much for being with me. Temple Talk.